Welcome back to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we have the great schus of reading Parsha Shemini. And when I say the great schus, I think it in two senses. One, Parsha Shemini is one of the Parshas Torah. It's a schus to read any Parsha in the Torah. But second of all, there's a sense of kind of fighting through the karbanos of Vayikra and Tzav and getting to Shemini, which has narrative, which is easier for us and is kind of a center point in terms of the Mishkan, right? Shemini, according to the Ramban, Vahi Bayom HaShemini is the 8th day of the Miluim, which is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is the first day, which is opening day of the Mishkan. And there's an issue sort of behind the Miluim and the opening day of the Mishkan that I think Rashi was sensitive to, the Ramban in particular is sensitive to that, and that is the role of Moshe and Aharon, or the related roles of Moshe and Aharon, right? And I think this in two senses. One, there's the sense that maybe Moshe is giving the job of Kohen Gadol. This comes up in a number of places. Maybe Moshe is giving the job of Kohen Gadol to Aharon, God forbid, because he's his brother. It's a classic case of nepotism. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that however you're going to understand the story of Chet HaEgel, Aharon played a role. All of these kinds of explanations and excuses and descriptions, but Aharon played a role in this, the greatest sin of Klal Yisrael up to this point. And does that allow him to be the Kohen Gadol? So both of these themes are shown in the Ramban. Let's do two related Rambans, one really short, one regular size one, just to sort of make this point and to understand it. So the parsha begins, Vahi Bayom HaShemini, Karo Moshe li Aharon ulevanav uleziknei Yisrael. So Moshe calls Aharon and his sons. They are, of course, all the Kohanim at the time. Vayomer el Aharon, Kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatas va'ayel le'olat tamimim v'hakrev lifnei Hashem. Ve'el b'nei Yisrael tidaber lemor, and to b'nei Yisrael tell them, Kechu sirizim lechatas v'egel v'chavas b'nei shanot tamimim lo'olah v'shava ayel lishlamim, etc., etc. And you find really kind of a fascinating Ramban. The Ramban, it's the first Ramban on this week's parsha. It says, "V'ta'am ve'el b'nei Yisrael tidaber lemor, sheyomar lohem Aharon came." Just Aharon. Moshe is telling Aharon, you should tell this to b'nei Yisrael. Why? And the Ramban says it. Ki ratza sheyihiyeh Aharon hamitzaveh b'shem Hashem, v'hu hamakriv karbanot ligadlo be'inei ha'am. He wanted Klal Yisrael to see Aharon as the Kohen Gadol. He wanted Klal Yisrael to see Aharon as telling Bnei Yisrael, this is what God wants of you. This is what God wants of us. And then Aharon brings the karbanos, which kind of raises the question of, why didn't Moshe bring all the karbanos during the Yemei HaMiluim for a week? Moshe brought the karbanos, and then Aharon took over on Yom HaShemini. Right? It's a fair question to ask. The Ramban doesn't deal with it directly, but the idea behind it, why wouldn't Aharon, if it was practice, if Aaron's going to have to do all these karbanos going forward, why didn't Aharon take care of the karbanos during the Yemei HaMiluim? And the sense I get from this Ramban and from the next Ramban is that Klal Yisrael saw Moshe as the leader. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu was the king of the Jews. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't sin at Chet HaEgel. He was up with HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai. And the idea is Moshe does the Miluim, and then he publicly hands the job to Aharon. So people know it's a really important job, because for a week, Moshe Rabbeinu did it. And for a week, the Shechina didn't appear, despite the fact that it was Moshe Rabbeinu. And on the 8th day, after some delay, the Shechina does appear. And the sense you get is that Moshe wanted Klal Yisrael to realize that Aharon was on his level and that he did it for a week, but now Aharon was taking over and Aharon was the Kohen Gadol, and Aharon deserves their respect. And if you look, this plays out in a Ramban in the same parak on Pasuk Zayin. The Pasuk says, Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, Krav el hamizbeach, va'aseh et chatatcha ve'et olatecha v'chaper ba'adcha va'ad ha'am, Va'ased karban ha'am v'chaper ba'adam kasher tziva Hashem. And the Ramban wants to know what's kravel hamizbeach. Just tell him what to do. What does it mean he should come close to the mizbeach? So the Ramban gives a simple pshat, and then he says, Aval. B'torat Kohanim nitorer rabotenu b'zeh. But in the Midrash Halacha, in the Torah's Kohanim, Chazal focused on this point. Umishalo mashal lema hadavar doma. And they have a parable. Lemelech basar vadam shenasa isha v'haita mitbayeshet milefanav. There's a woman who marries a king, but then she's nervous. She doesn't want to consummate the marriage with him because he's the king and she's just a regular person. So it's an unbelievable parallel, and you could see how sensitive Chazal were to this issue. Nichnesa etzla achota. So her sister comes to see her. Her sister, obviously, in the parable, going to be Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the brother of Aharon. Amrala achoti. Lama nichnasta ledavar zeh, or lama nichnast ledavar zeh, lo shetishamshia tamelech. Why'd you marry him to begin with? If you're not going to serve him, if you're not going to service him, if you're not going to have relations with him, hagisi da'atech, toughen up, embolden yourself, uboi shimshia tamelech, and do the job for which you're supposed to do it. Kach amar lo Moshe la'Aharon. So Moshe says to Aaron, Achi, lama nivcharta lihiyot kohen gadol. Why were you chosen to be the kohen gadol? Lo shetisharesh lifnei hamakom. Wasn't it for this exact purpose? To serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to bring karbanos? Hageis da'atcha, embolden yourself, ubo va'avod avodatecha, and come and do the avoda. That's what you're here for. Okay, so that's the first idea. That Moshe Rabbeinu has to support Aharon, who's nervous. Now, in this telling, he's probably nervous not because of the chait of the Egel HaZahav. He's a regular person, and this is serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But then the Medrash goes on. V'yesh omrim, haya Aharon ro'eh et hamizbeach kitavnit shor. When Aharon saw the mizbeach, he saw it as the para aduma. Right? It's like a strange thing, but he was so obsessed and he felt so guilty over his sin. When he came to the mizbeach, maybe the four corners, the horns, it looked like tavnit shor. V'haya mityarei mimen. He was terrified. Nichnas Moshe etzlo amar lo, Aharon achi, lo tira mima shata mityarei. Don't be afraid. Hageis da'atcha, embolden yourself, toughen up. Uba kravelav, kravel hamizbeach, go to the mizbeach, don't be afraid of it. Lekach amar kravel hamizbeach, vayikravel hamizbeach. That's why the Torah emphasizes that Aharon actually came close to the mizbeach, because he was afraid. Bizrizut, with alacrity, with energy, with excitement. Okay? So again, you have this idea of Aharon kind of being afraid of becoming the Kohen Gadol, and Moshe emboldening him, and Moshe supporting him. V'ta'am zeh, ki ba'avur shaya Aharon kidosh Hashem. Now, why is Aharon terrified? So he says, no question. First of all, the Ramban loves Aharon, really loves Aharon in every possible way, maybe more than Moshe Rabbeinu. So Aharon was kidosh Hashem. Ve'ein benafsho chet zulatim ma'aseh ha'egel. He never ever sinned in his life except for the chet ha'egel. Haya ha'chet hahu kavua lo b'machshavto. And Aharon was obsessed with it. His one sin was making the Egel Hazav. And now he's being asked to serve God in the Mishkan, the most important, the greatest job ever. Kinyan shenemar v'chatati negdi tamid. Right? The Pasuk in Tehillim says, on the one hand, we are supposed to remind ourselves constantly of our sins. And so Aharon is not just reminding himself of it, he's obsessed with it. Right? He sees the Mizbeach as a form of the Egel. Vaya nidmelo ki'ilu tsurat ha'egel sham ma'akev b'kaparatov. And he's looking at the Egel and he's saying, how can this give me kapara? How can it give Klal Yisrael kapara? It's reminding them of the Egel HaZahav. And you have to realize here, for the Ramban, it's true. God gave the mitzvah of the Mishkan to Klal Yisrael as a response to Maimad Har Sinai before the Chet HaEgel. But the fact is, they only got around to building the Mishkan, and they certainly only got around to dedicating the Mishkan after Chet HaEgel. So the Ramban is sensitive to the fact of how things played out, right? If Aharon took over for Moshe before the Chet HaEgel, it would have been a different story. He had never sinned. But once he sinned, he's concerned. Ulekach amar lo hageis da'atcha shelo yihiyeh shval ruach kol kach shekvar rotza lokim et ma'asav. Moshe says to Aharon, don't be so humble. Don't be so terrified. God has already forgiven you. Do the job. Okay? And then the Medrash goes on with other examples of the Satan. And the sense you get is that, Aharon had to overcome this. V'ta'am, now he goes back to the Psukim and says, Ramban, V'ta'am v'chaper ba'atcha uvad ha'am, you'll get kapara, and the people will get kapara. The Ramban says that's chronological. Yomar, krav al ha'mizbech la'asot kol ha'karbanot. However, va'asei tchila et chatatcha ve'et olatecha. First, bring your karban. V'chaper ba'atcha tchila b'karbanotecha. Right? You need kapara. But once God accepts that, then uva'ad ha'am acharei kain, then you can bring kapara for the people, which reminds us, of course, of the Avodas Yom HaKippurim, where first he says vidui for himself and for his family, then he says vidui for the rest of Shevet Levi, then and only then he says vidui for all of Klal Yisrael. First you need kapara, then you can be the shaliach to bring kapara to others. Sheta'aseh karban ha'am v'chaper ba'adam bikarbanam, limeid oto she'avo zakai, v'chaper ala chayav. Right? First you come having been forgiven already, and you can then get kapara for the rest of Klal Yisrael. So this gives us, I think, an insight into the subtext of not just the relationship between Moshe and Aharon, but Aharon taking on the job, as Moshe's brother, right, as is mentioned in the Medrash with the two sisters. Here it's two brothers. And second, as having participated in a great sin and now being the person who brings kapara to Klal Yisrael, it was important that Moshe both show Klal Yisrael who Aharon was and convince Aharon that he was worthy of the job. Okay. Now, a side point, but a fascinating side point, we find in Pasuk Chaf Bet of the same parak. Says the Torah, okay, Aharon brings the karbanot. Now, Vayisa Aharon et yadav el ha'am vayivarachem, vayered me'asot ha'chatat v'ha'olav ha'shlamim. Okay, Aharon, after bringing the karbanos, blesses Klal Yisrael. The question is, okay, what was the blessing? We're curious to know. So Rashi says, Birkat Kohanim, Yivarecha Hashem, Yo'er Hashem, Yisa Hashem. That's Rashi. Now, why does this bother the Ramban? So he says, Ve'im Kain, if Rashi's right, Ye Parshat Daber al Aharon ve'el Banav lemor Kot Tvarchu et Bnei Yisrael Shemechumash HaPekudim. Then, right, we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the mitzvah of Birkas Kohanim to Aharon and his sons, and we know that he did it in Parshas Naso, which obviously doesn't come to, the end of Naso doesn't come to Sefer Bamidbar. And the Ramban is sensitive to these things. That would be Muktemet Lezeh. So he's giving the bracha of Birchas Kohanim well before the text is given to him and to Klal Yisrael. So first of all, the Ramban says, V'ulai Kenhu. Yes, I believe Yesh Mukdam Muchar B'Torah, but I believe there are exceptions also. Maybe that's the case. Ki Yismoch L'Masha Nemar Sham Vahi biyom kalot Moshe la'akim et hamishkan. Because in Naso, we're talking about the same day as Parsha Shemini, right? The Karbanos HaNesiim, all 12. The most boring part of the Torah. When it tells you every single Karban that they brought, the exact same thing 12 times. That happened today. That happened on Yom HaShmini. That's part of the Chanukas HaMishkan. So the Ramban says, okay, I'd be willing if I had to accept that that's not out of order. That's how the Torah does it. And maybe, so the Ramban here is saying, maybe he said Yivarecha Hashem along the lines that he had gotten in Parshas Naso. But the Ramban would rather not say that. So he says, V'yitachen lomar, it's possible to say, Ki Aharon peirash kapav hashamayim ubeirech et ha'am ka'asher asa Shlomo. No, he didn't say Birkat Kohanim. When you extend your arms for Birkat Kohanim, you extend your arms towards the people. Aharon extended his arms up, exactly like Shlomo HaMelech did when he built the Mishkan. Shlomo HaMelech was not a Kohen. He didn't say Birkat Kohanim. So he extended his arms. Vayamod Shlomo lifnei mizbach Hashem vayifros kapav hashamayim, right? To heaven, not to Klal Yisrael. V'shom ne'amar vayamod vayivarech et kol kahal Yisrael kol gadol lemor. Right? He blessed them with some blessing. Lefikach lo hizkir hakatuv shetzivo to Moshe lasod kein. Therefore, the Torah doesn't say any place that Moshe Rabbeinu told Aaron to do this. Because he didn't. He didn't give him a text. Ubebraisa shel parshas miluim b'toas kohanim ra'iti vayivarchem zo bracha stuma she'i ata yoda'a. Right? We don't know the text. Aaron HaKohen made up his own bracha, and he blessed Klal Yisrael. Chazar HaKatuv u'pereish lahalan, but then the Medrash says no. But then God explains later, the Torah explains later, that it was Yivarech Hashem Yishmerecha, Yah Hashem panav elecha v'chuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha. Now, how would that work? So he says, V'adayin yesh lo lomar shekach amaro. Says the Ramban, I think it's the following. Bracha zo shebeirech Aharon et ha'am me'atzmo, situ mahi. We don't know what it is. V'lo pireish lanu akatuv mahi. And the Torah doesn't tell us what the text was. Aval bracha shenitztava hakohanim lidorot nit parsha. In Naso, it's not a one-time bracha. In Naso, God is saying to the Kohanim, this is the text of the bracha that you're supposed to bless Klal Yisrael with every single day. Right? The fact that we don't do it in Chutz La'aretz is a pella. It's a wonder, and it's probably wrong. But V'hi shava b'chal hakohanim la'olam. It's going to be the same for all Kohanim worldwide. Oh, or shehem sfurim shekan siva to b'nisiyut kapayim liyom zeh ulehalan netana bracha zo lo ulevanav lidorot. So says the Ramban, really two possibilities. One is, yes, we don't know the text of the bracha. We'd love to know the text. Aaron blessed them a special blessing. It wasn't Birkat Kohanim. The second possibility is, yes, Aaron blessed them with Birkat Kohanim, but not because Moshe told him to, and not because that was the bracha that the Kohanim were supposed to give to Klal Yisrael forever. That comes in Naso. When Naso comes, that's the bracha that has to be said by the Kohanim forever. But earlier in the day, Aaron could give either Birkat Kohanim as a one-time bracha, not the bracha that's going to be given forever. It's just a coincidence that he used the same text. Or he said something else, right? Interesting, and it's something you find a number of times in the Ramban, is that the Torah doesn't have to tell us everything. There are things the Torah can allude to, the text of which we don't know. And this is one of the possibilities, right? The Torah says that Aaron blessed Klal Yisrael. The Torah doesn't have to tell us exactly what he said. We may be curious, but the Torah doesn't have to tell us exactly what he said. Okay, the psukim then go on. Vateitze eish milifnei Hashem vatochal al hamizbech et ha'olav et ha'chalavim vayar kol ha'am vayaronu vayiplu al pneihem. Right? The high point. Finally, not Moshe, as the Ramban points out, but Aaron brings the Shechina, brings the fire down. Aaron proves to everyone that he's supposed to be the Kohen Gadol, and the Mishkan starts to function. Okay, to be honest with you, I wanted to talk about the Ramban that, like everyone else, has a suggestion for the sin of Nadav and Avihu. All right, Vayikru b'nei Aaron Nadav and Avihu ish machtato vayitnu bohen eish vayasimu la ketoret vayakrivu lifnei Hashem eish zara asher lo tziva utam. And, you know, because the Torah doesn't tell us what the sin of Nadav and Avihu are, so everybody piles on. And Nadav and Avihu turned out to be the worst people ever. They were shtu yayin. They paskin halacha lifnei Moshe v'Aaron their rebbeim. They brought the wrong kind of karban, right? They weren't supposed to bring Ketores and they brought Ketores. The Ramban's explanation of the sin of Nadav and Avihu is very, very Kabbalistic. I tried my best. I'm sorry. I'm happy for people to look at it and for people to be in touch with me as to what the pshat is. But there's a related Ramban that I do want to discuss, which I think is fascinating and goes to the sin in a roundabout way. It says the Torah in the next parak. Vaydaber Hashem el Aharon lemor, Yayin v'shechar al teisht ata uvanecha itach bevoachem alo moed v'lo tamutu chukat olam l'dorotechem. Right? This is the idea that Chazal got, that the sin was they were nichnasu shtu yayin, that they were drunk. Because God then turns to Aharon and tells him, you know, don't drink, don't be drunk. And that's certainly the support for Rashi's idea. And now, the Ramban is focused on something interesting, something else, but we'll get back to the point. What's shechar? Yayin v'shechar. Is it the same thing or is it something different? So Rashi says, Yayin derech shichruto. Right? You can't drink wine that intoxicates. So shechar is kind of an adjective to yayin. Okay, uperusho. She'im hifsik bo o shenatan letocho ma'at mayim patur. The result would be, if you don't guzzle wine in a way that's going to intoxicate you, if you take a sip and you take a break and you take a sip and you take a break, or you dilute it so it's not going to be intoxicating, you could drink wine. Okay? That's one pshat. V'ta'ato shel harav shalo huzharu el ala yayin lo al shara mishakrim. And so for Rashi, Kohanim weren't warned against other intoxicants. Maybe they could drink beer. They're not allowed to drink wine that intoxicates. V'nulmod shechar min ha-nazir. But then we'll learn shechar from the nazir. It would be any intoxicant. But here it wouldn't be. Okay? V'chein hadavar lefi dati. And I agree with Rashi. Aval al da'at Rav Moshe. But the Rambam thinks differently. He thinks, al sha'ar ha-mashkim ba'azhara. In terms of beer and other intoxicants, that's a regular lav. V'shechar kipshuto. And shechar means those things. V'hatam b'tzava'ah hazot ata. Okay, so now we get to the real point. Why is the Torah commanding us now? V'ata b'tzava'ah hazot ata shelo yiteh hakohen b'shichrut hayayin. Because if you get drunk, you're going to be confused. You're going to be easily confused. V'yavo lidei machshava she'ena kahogen v'yamut ba ka'asher asu banav. Says the Ramban, the sin of Nadav and Avihu was not according to this medrash, that they were drunk. The sin was they made a terrible decision. They brought a carbon that wasn't for them to bring. They thought that there were no barriers and they came close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, it's possible that they made that mistake because they were drunk. But the Aveira, says the Ramban, is not drunkenness. The Aveira is the Aveira. It's the mistake that they made. V'yitachen ki mashe darshu shayu Nadav Avihu shtu yayin lomar ki mipnei yeinam ta'u be'esh zara. Right? It's fascinating. Says the Ramban, even if they were drunk, that's not why God killed them. God killed them because they brought an Eish Zara. Now, they brought the Eish Zara perhaps because they weren't clear-minded, and that's a problem. And that's why the Torah tells us not to do it. But that's not their sin. Their sin was the Eish Zara. Lo sheyihiyeh ha'onesh mipnei hayayin ki adayin lo huzuru mimenu. How could they punish Nadav and Avihu, says the Ramban, for being drunk, when the Torah yet hasn't forbidden the Kohen from drinking? It's coming now. It didn't come before. Aval onsham sheta'u be'esh Hashem ka'asher ramazti. Their mistake was that they brought in Eish Zara, whatever that means. And I urge you to look, and I urge you to try to figure it out. But here's the fascinating thing. The Ramban says the cause of the sin may have been the fact that they drank. But that's not the sin, right? The problem with drinking is that it's going to lead to all kinds of things, and therefore the Torah says it's also for Kohanim to drink. But it's not the drinking that's the sin. It's almost like the drinking is a geder against other mistakes. A Kohen has to be absolutely clear-minded when he does the avodah. And anything that detracts from that, anything that distracts him, anything that serves as a nuisance to that, that's wrong. But that's not the sin. And, in the discussion, it comes up a lot of times in learning, right? Could there be such a thing as a harchaka or as a geder min haTorah? Right? So we're moving close to Pesach. The most obvious example is the Ran, who says that Bal Yiro, Bal Yimatzeh is a geder to the Isser Achilas Chametz on Pesach. This might be another example of this. This, where the Ramban says the Torah prohibited drinking for a Kohen, not because drinking for a Kohen is in and of itself a sin, but because what it's going to lead to. And at the end of the day, Kohanim need to be absolutely clear-headed and absolutely focused on their avodah, right? There are all these psulim that come about because of strange thoughts and foreign thoughts. And the Ramban thinks that the prohibition for Kohanim to drink is protective of their avodah, right? If a Kohen's drunk, he won't be able to do the avodah. The sin is not that he's drunk. The sin is that he won't be able to do the avodah, and that's the focus. Okay, let's stop here for today. We saw the story, the dramatic story of Moshe and Aharon, and Moshe basically pumping up his brother to make him believe that, one, he's deserving to be the Kohen Gadol, and two, God has forgiven him for his sin of Chet HaEgel and Aaron's fears in the other direction. We saw a fascinating Ramban about Birkat Kohanim, where the Ramban wants to keep the Torah chronological. He wants to support his shita of Yesh Mukdam U'Muchar B'Torah, even though he's willing to say that this is an exception. He doesn't think it's 100% the case that Yesh Mukdam U'Muchar B'Torah. We'll see in Bamidbar. There are some cases where the Torah gives you the date, and the date is before some other date that's going to come later. And the Ramban has to admit that that's out of order. But as a general rule, he wants things to be in order. And so he thinks either Aharon blessed Klal Yisrael with a different text, which the Torah doesn't tell us, or he intuited or anticipated Birkat Kohanim, but it wasn't part of the commandment that God gave later on in Nassau. And finally, we just saw this fascinating idea in the Ramban of a geder midoraisa, that the sin of drinking for Kohanim is not drinking itself, it's what it's going to do to them. And that Kohanim need to be solely focused and single-purposed in their avodah, and anything that gets in the way of that is something that's going to be asur, not because it's asur in and of itself, but because it's going to lead to something terrible with respect to the avodah. That's it for today. Yashkoach to everyone, and Shabbat Shalom.